Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me for the first in a series of breakfasts here on Microsoft LinkedIn. Our mission at Microsoft is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. We have intentionally created a purpose-driven mission for our company and introduced a culture that could help us achieve that mission. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to people. How we leverage their unique differences and strengths, tapping on past experiences, learning new perspectives, and stretching our thinking to succeed. This is what we mean by winning with talent. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Professor Tan Joo Seng, Professor, from the Nanyang Business School, Nanyang Technology University, and Su-yen Wong, board member, speaker, and well-known in this circuit, to talk about the perspectives of winning with talent and why diversity, inclusion, and talent retention are so important to a company's growth and continued success. Good morning to you both. So, Professor, you work with a lot of leaders across Asia. What is your advice on building resilience in the workforce?
Right now, I think that's a key topic. A lot of organizations thinking how they get their employees stay engaged in the workforce in terms of many issues and challenges out there. I think one thing I hear a lot about is basically about staying agile as they cope with the disruption out there, and how do employees get their morale up and maintain their sense of a purpose in terms of driving the business in this very challenging time. I think so being open to new possibilities out there. So I think for me it will be two things, agility and being open.
One of the things that is really critical for organizations to recognize is that work is changing and becoming more open, in fact. So as the workforce is being disrupted, the policies and processes that we put in place as organizations also need to adapt. So some of the things that we have very frequently, things like the processes around, policies around working hours, vacation days, no longer seem relevant in a time, particularly now when people are working much more flexibly. So I think number one, companies really need to think about how work is changing, and then number two, ensure that what they do is aligned to support that.
And hence the lead-in into retention and skills. This is an environment where there are more options available, and yet we are in a situation where skills, supply and demand do not match. And we're so incredibly proud of the work we've done at Microsoft. We have upskilled up to 1.5 million people in Asia and perhaps 10 million globally. Professor Tan, what advice do you have for, again, leaders in the business environment purely around hiring, retaining skills in a world which is becoming more competitive?
I think companies with that North Star shining brightly out there will continue to attract talents from anywhere and around the world. A sense of purpose, a sense of mission, I think that's going to be a key differentiator as well as a key attractor for talents out there.
And Su-yen?
Fundamentally, companies really need to focus on how they upskill and help their employees reinvent themselves. You talk about this mismatch in supply and demand. It's because we need to help people evolve their skill sets. And I think get rid of some of the notions, outdated notions around who can and cannot do certain things, or what kind of background you need for certain kinds of jobs. All of that's really being turned upside down. So re-looking at the value proposition in terms of development of an individual in their overall career lifespan. Don't just hire for today, hire for tomorrow as well.
It actually brings us to the topic of diversity and inclusion, which is multidimensional. And both of you spoke about the need for thinking wider and to different skill sets and different organizations, different opportunities can come through. As you think about diversity and inclusion, how do we expand the dimensions?
First, I would say there's a lot that's being done from a gender perspective, and that's important. But it's equally important to look beyond, number one, gender, to other dimensions, educational background, age, there are lots of different dimensions that bring us preconceived biases and notions. Second, beyond looking at the observable characteristics, it's those characteristics that are actually harder to tell. I mean, you can tell the demographic dimensions, but what is really difficult is how people think, because they've had a different life experience, a different educational background, put them all together, and that's when the magic actually happens.
You know, it's interesting you say that. I grew up in a country with 14 official languages, 550 dialects, and have the opportunity to be part of a business which goes all the way from Nepal to New Zealand, from Japan to Singapore, and there's just the diversity we miss a lot. Yeah. So, Professor, as we think about Microsoft, and Microsoft is pushing really hard the boundaries on diversity and inclusion, from your lens, what would you do differently?
I think there's always space for greater self-awareness among leaders and the people themselves. I think diversity inclusion for me is a two-way street. So as you have high self-awareness about diversity and the other party you react or deal with in any settings, I think it will help also to create that co-awareness with your co-workers and so on. I think that can foster a spirit of a mutual understanding, deeper appreciation of diversity.
So Su-yen and Professor, you know, we spent a few minutes talking about the business environment we're in, talent, resilience, the challenges. And we have evidence to prove that the environment, which is new for us, has proven quite challenging. People have been working from homes, they're living with families in constrained environments. Professor, starting with you, what do you think is the impact that this creates?
There are two kinds of impact really, basically in terms of this challenging work environment for employees out there. One, I think, is obviously in terms of the mental stress. They were probably coping more with the challenges and uncertainty out there. I think this can take its toll if they are not aware how to cope with this. I think little things that along the way where the leaders check in with the team in terms of how they're getting on, a phone call, a hello, a chat. I think that helps to keep the relationship going, the engagement. Because I think arising from this part of remote working is that people are feeling disengaged from the workplace. I think this sense of disengagement, I think is important because you don't see the usual colleagues, the usual work environment, the usual customers out there. So I think this human-to-human connection needs to be there to cope with this. And I think this helps people to maintain that psychological resilience, emotional resilience that's important. I think instead of burning out, they should burn bright. I think burning bright is important. I think that together they can mutually support each other as they go through this process.
Su-yen, it's an interesting point that Professor raised about burning bright. And we have seen that the cognitive load on the brain is much higher actually in video interaction versus actually physical interactions. What advice would you have for business leaders to think about managing this challenging situation?
Two things. Number one, I think we have to get the issue of mental wellness out in the open. You know, if somebody comes into the office and they've sprained their ankle, everybody goes, "Oh my goodness, what happened? How are you?" Right? So that's a natural reaction. But we don't do the same necessarily for mental health, which is a cause that's very dear to me. And so I think we need to get leaders to be willing to speak about it and to be able to not, treat it as sort of something that needs to be hidden away. Second, equally, I'm really big into alignment. Your policies and your processes have to be aligned. So if you say mental health is really important, but then on the back end, the benefits that you provide don't provide support for that, well, then what does that say to your colleagues and your team members and your staff, right? So the alignment between what we say and what we do is absolutely critical.
Thank you, Su-yen. Thank you, Professor. What a fascinating topic. So much of insight, so much of learning, but we barely scratched the surface. I'd love to hear from you and hear your perspective and comments. But for now, we have to wrap up. Until next time, bye-bye. Have a wonderful day.